The iron shackles bit into Dorothy Ruiz's wrists as the church elders dragged her toward the makeshift auction block in the town square. Snow swirled around her bare feet, each flake a tiny knife against her skin. The crowd gathered like vultures, their faces twisted with righteous indignation and barely concealed greed. She had become nothing more than property to be sold, a widow's debt transformed into flesh and bone currency. Lot 17, called out Elder Morrison, his voice carrying across the bitter Montana wind. One woman aged 26 to satisfy outstanding church fines of $300. Bidding starts at 50. Dorothy's breath came in short, visible puffs as she scanned the crowd. These were her neighbors, people she had served alongside in the church kitchen, women whose children she had minded when fever struck their households. Now they watched her humiliation with the detached interest of livestock buyers. Her husband Thomas had been dead only 3 months, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and the church's demands for payment of his gambling losses. The bidding began slowly. A rancher from the South Valley offered $50. Another man, reeking of whiskey and wearing clothes that hadn't seen soap in months, raised it to 75. Dorothy closed her eyes, trying to disappear into herself, when a voice cut through the winter air like a blade. $300. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Dorothy opened her eyes to see a man she had never encountered before, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat that spoke of wilderness living. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his beard was trimmed but wild. Most striking were his eyes, a deep brown that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. This was Matthew Ramos, though she did not yet know his name. Elder Morrison sputtered, "Sir, the bidding has only just begun. Surely you don't mean to end it so quickly?" "I mean exactly what I said." Matthew's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. $300, cash. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of coins, the exact amount of her debt. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The tension in that square was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Dorothy's fate hung in the balance of this stranger's unexpected intervention. The elder's eyes gleamed with avarice as he looked at the pouch. "Very well, sold to the gentleman for $300. He banged his gavel against the wooden podium with unnecessary force. "The debt is satisfied." Matthew stepped forward, ignoring the murmurs and stares of the crowd. He approached Dorothy with careful, measured steps, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. When he reached her, he did something that shocked everyone present, including Dorothy herself. He removed his own coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "My name is Matthew Ramos," he said quietly. His words meant only for her ears. "I live in the mountains about a day's ride north. You'll be safe there." Dorothy stared at him, trying to understand what had just happened. "Why," she whispered, "you don't even know me." "I know enough." His fingers worked quickly at the shackles on her wrists, producing a small key that made the elder frown. "I know you don't deserve this." As the iron fell away from her wrists, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, but it was tempered by wariness. In her experience, men who helped women always expected payment of one kind or another. Still, anything was better than being sold to the highest bidder among the townspeople who had watched her husband drink away their future and done nothing to help. Matthew helped her down from the platform, his touch gentle but impersonal. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she managed, though her voice was barely audible. "Good. We leave now." The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded. Some looked disappointed that the spectacle had ended so quickly and cleanly. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about the mysterious mountain man who had appeared like something from a frontier legend to claim the widow. Matthew led her to where two horses waited, both sturdy mountain breeds built for harsh terrain and bitter weather. He helped her mount the smaller mare, adjusting the stirrups without being asked. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting he was accustomed to caring for others in the wilderness. As they rode out of town, Dorothy pulled his coat tighter around herself and tried to process what had happened. 3 hours ago, she had been facing a future as someone's unwilling servant, or worse. Now she was riding into the unknown with the stranger who had paid a fortune for her freedom. The irony was not lost on her that she was still, in essence, owned by a man, just a different one than the church elders had intended. The journey into the mountains began in silence. Matthew rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain for dangers Dorothy couldn't even imagine. The snow had intensified, creating a white curtain that muffled sound and limited visibility. She had lived her entire life in the valley town, venturing no farther than the nearest farms. This wilderness was alien territory. After an hour of riding, Matthew called a halt near a stand of pine trees that offered some shelter from the wind. He dismounted and approached her horse, offering his hand to help her down. Dorothy hesitated for a moment before accepting his assistance. Her legs were unsteady from cold and shock when her feet touched the ground. "We'll rest here for a few minutes," Matthew said, pulling supplies from his saddlebags. "Let the horses catch their breath before the steep climb ahead." He produced a metal flask and offered it to her. Dorothy uncapped it cautiously, expecting whiskey, but found hot coffee instead. The warmth spread through her chest and belly, more comforting than she could have imagined. "How did you know?" she asked, finally finding her voice. "About the auction, I mean." Matthew was checking his horse's hooves, his movements methodical and sure. "Word travels fast in small places. I was in town for supplies when I heard what the church planned to do." He straightened and looked at her directly. "It was wrong. But $300. Dorothy shook her head. "That's more money than most people see in a year. Why would you spend it on someone you don't know?" "Maybe I know more than you think." Matthew's expression was unreadable. "Your husband Thomas worked the Copper Creek mine. Good man, from what I heard. Didn't deserve what happened to him." Dorothy's throat tightened. "You knew Thomas?" "We met a few times. He mentioned his wife, said she was the strongest person he knew." Matthew began repacking his supplies. Said she deserved better than what life had given her. Tears threatened to spill down Dorothy's cheeks. Thomas had been many things, not all of them good, but he had loved her in his flawed, desperate way. Hearing that he had spoken of her with pride to strangers touched something deep inside her chest. "The church said his gambling debts were my responsibility," she said. "That as his widow I had to make good on what he owed. The church said a lot of things that weren't true." Matthew's voice carried an edge of anger. "A woman isn't responsible for her dead husband's sins." They remounted and continued climbing into the mountains. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding between massive boulders and stands of evergreen trees that creaked ominously in the wind. Dorothy had never been this far from civilization, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Bears, wolves, mountain cats, all the creatures that existed only in stories told around winter fires. But Matthew moved through this landscape like he belonged to it. His horse responded to subtle shifts in his weight and posture, navigating obstacles that would have challenged an experienced rider. He was, Dorothy realized, completely at home in this wilderness that terrified her. As afternoon faded toward evening, they crested a ridge, and Dorothy saw Matthew's home for the first time. It was not what she had expected. Instead of a rough cabin, she saw a substantial log house with glass windows and a stone chimney, from which smoke rose in a straight column. Outbuildings dotted the clearing, including a barn that looked capable of housing a dozen horses. This was not the dwelling of a hermit or a savage, but of a man who had built something permanent and substantial in the wilderness. "Welcome to your new home," Matthew said simply. Dorothy stared at the scene before her. "It's beautiful." "It's isolated," Matthew replied. "The nearest neighbor is 2 days' ride south. In winter, we might not see another soul for months at a time. If that's going to be a problem, you should say so now." She considered his words carefully. Isolation had been her reality in town as well, surrounded by people who judged her for her husband's failings and her own poverty. At least here, the solitude would be honest. "I think I can manage," she said. Matthew nodded and urged his horse forward. As they approached the house, Dorothy noticed details that spoke of careful planning and skilled craftsmanship. The logs were perfectly fitted, chinked with clay that showed no gaps for wind or moisture. The roof was steep enough to shed snow efficiently, and the windows were positioned to capture maximum light during the short winter days. A dog emerged from the barn as they approached, a large mixed breed with intelligent eyes and a coat that suggested both wolf and domestic lineage. The animal approached Matthew's horse with obvious familiarity, but regarded Dorothy with careful assessment. "That's Kaiser," Matthew said, dismounting. "He's particular about strangers, but he'll warm up to you." Matthew helped Dorothy down from her horse and led both animals toward the barn. The interior was as well organized as everything else she had seen, with stalls for 6 horses and storage for feed and equipment. He worked efficiently, unsaddling the horses and rubbing them down with practiced motions. "You built all this yourself?" Dorothy asked, watching him work. "Most of it had help with the heavy timber raising. Matthew hung the saddles on wooden pegs. Took 3 years to get it the way I wanted." Dorothy followed him from the barn to the house, Kaiser trotting alongside with his assessment of her still pending. The front door was solid oak with iron hinges that spoke of quality craftsmanship. Matthew opened it and gestured for her to enter first. The interior of the house was a revelation. Dorothy had expected rough frontier accommodations, but instead found herself in a space that was both comfortable and refined. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a fire already burning low in the grate. Furniture was sparse but well made, including a dining table that could seat 8 people and bookshelves lined with more volumes than she had ever seen in a private home. "You read," she said, approaching the shelves with wonder. "Long winters," Matthew replied, removing his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Not much else to do when the snow gets deep." Dorothy ran her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume. "I can read too. Thomas taught me, though the church elders didn't approve. They said women had no need for letters beyond what was necessary for household accounts. The church elders were wrong about a lot of things." Matthew moved to the fireplace and added wood to the dying flames. "You're welcome to read anything you like." The gesture was small, but it meant more to Dorothy than he could know. In her married life, books had been a luxury she couldn't afford, and the few she had owned were sold to pay for Thomas's funeral. The idea of having access to knowledge and stories again felt like a gift beyond measure. Matthew showed her through the rest of the house. There were 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that must have cost a fortune to transport into the mountains, and even a small room that served as an office. Everything was clean and organized, suggesting habits of discipline and self-sufficiency. "You'll have the room at the end of the hall," Matthew said, opening a door to reveal a space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley they had climbed from. "It's not much, but it's private." Dorothy stepped inside and set her few possessions on the dresser. The room was simple but comfortable, with a quilt on the bed that showed the work of skilled hands. "Did you make this?" she asked, touching the intricate pattern. "My sister, before she married and moved to California." Matthew's voice carried a note of sadness. "She said every house needed something beautiful in it." She was right. Dorothy smoothed the quilt with gentle fingers. "It's lovely." Matthew left her to settle in while he prepared dinner. Dorothy used the time to explore her new surroundings more thoroughly. The window in her room offered a view that stretched for miles across snow-covered peaks and valleys. It was beautiful, but also emphasized just how far she was from everything she had known. When she emerged from her room, she found Matthew in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like venison stew. He moved around the space with the same efficiency he had shown with the horses, clearly comfortable with domestic tasks that many men would have considered beneath him. "Can I help?" Dorothy asked. Matthew looked up from where he was cutting vegetables. "You don't have to. You're not a servant here." "I know, but I'd like to contribute something. I'm a good cook when I have ingredients to work with." He considered her offer for a moment, then nodded toward a cupboard. "There's bread in there if you want to slice it, and butter in the coal box outside the back door." Working together in the kitchen felt surprisingly natural. Matthew was not a man who filled silence with unnecessary words, but his presence was comfortable rather than oppressive. Dorothy found herself relaxing for the first time in months, her shoulders losing the permanent tension that had become her normal state. Over dinner, they talked carefully around the edges of their respective histories. Matthew had been living in the mountains for 5 years, having come west from somewhere he didn't specify after something he didn't describe. Dorothy shared selective details about her marriage and the events that had led to her public humiliation. Neither pushed the other for information they weren't ready to give. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked as they finished eating. "What do you mean?" You paid $300 for me. The whole town witnessed it. In the eyes of the law and the church, I belong to you now. Dorothy met his gaze steadily. So what do you expect in return? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I expect you to heal, he said finally. I expect you to remember that you're a person, not property. Beyond that, we'll figure things out as we go. And if I decide I want to leave, then you leave. Matthew's response was immediate and certain. I'm not in the business of keeping people against their will. Dorothy studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. She found none, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about trusting men's promises. I don't understand you, she said. You don't have to. Not yet. Matthew stood and began clearing the dishes. Understanding takes time. That night, Dorothy lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the mountain wilderness. Wind sighed through the pine trees outside of her window. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the sound both beautiful and lonely. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and tried to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. 12 hours ago, she had been facing a future as someone's property, sold to satisfy debts she had not incurred. Now she was in a comfortable bed in a warm house, treated with more respect than she had received in years. It was too good to be true, which meant there had to be a catch. Men like Matthew Ramos didn't exist, didn't spend fortunes to help strangers without expecting something in return. But as she drifted toward sleep, Dorothy found herself hoping that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong about that. The next morning, Dorothy woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through her window, revealing a landscape transformed by fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Everything was pristine white, beautiful and alien. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Matthew preparing breakfast with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. Good morning, he said without turning around. Sleep well? Better than I expected. Dorothy moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered clearing. It's so quiet here. You'll get used to it, or it'll drive you mad. Matthew's tone suggested he was only half joking. Some people can't handle the isolation. What about you? Do you ever get lonely? Matthew paused in his cooking, considering the question. Sometimes, but I've learned to prefer my own company to the wrong company. Dorothy understood that sentiment better than he might have guessed. Her marriage had often been lonelier than solitude, filled with the presence of someone who was physically there but emotionally absent. At least here, the quiet was honest. After breakfast, Matthew showed her around the property more thoroughly. The barn housed not just horses but also 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and a pig that regarded Dorothy with intelligent eyes. There was a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar stocked with vegetables and preserved goods, and a workshop where Matthew crafted the furniture she had admired in the house. You're completely self-sufficient, Dorothy observed. Have to be, this far from town. The nearest store is a 2-day ride, and that's in good weather. In winter, we might be cut off for months at a time. Matthew checked the water level in the horse's trough. It's not a life for everyone. Dorothy was beginning to understand the full implications of her new situation. This wasn't just isolation from society. It was complete dependence on Matthew's skills and preparation for survival. If something happened to him, she would be alone in the wilderness with winter closing in and no way to reach help. Are you trying to scare me? She asked. I'm trying to be honest with you. Matthew's expression was serious. You need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't a temporary arrangement until you figure out something else. If you stay here, this becomes your life. And if I go back to town, then you go back to being property. The church won't forget about you, and there are men there who would be happy to take advantage of a woman with no protection. Dorothy nodded slowly. She had seen what happened to women who fell outside society's protection. It was not a fate she wanted to embrace. Over the following days, Dorothy began to learn the rhythms of life in the mountains. Matthew was an early riser by saying, up before dawn to tend the animals and check the weather. He moved through his daily routines with practiced efficiency, every action serving a purpose in the larger goal of survival and comfort. Dorothy found ways to contribute. She took over the cooking, discovering that Matthew's supplies were more extensive than she had expected. He had flour, sugar, preserved fruits, and spices that spoke of careful planning and significant expense. She also began tending the chickens and helping with other daily chores. But it was in the evenings that she began to understand Matthew as a person, rather than just her mysterious benefactor. He was well educated, with knowledge that ranged from literature to engineering to medicine. His books revealed interests in history, philosophy, and natural science. This was not a man who had fled to the mountains out of ignorance or inability to function in civilized society. "What did you do before you came here?" Dorothy asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Matthew was carving a piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced skill. "I was an engineer, built bridges and railroads back east." "That must have been important work." "It was profitable work." Matthew's tone suggested a distinction he considered significant. "Important is something different." "What made you leave?" Matthew's hands stilled on his carving. "The war changed things. Changed me. When I came back, I found I couldn't stomach the politics and corruption that went with the work. So I took my savings and came west." Dorothy sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't push. She was learning that Matthew shared information on his own timeline, and pressing him would only cause him to withdraw. As the days passed, Dorothy began to relax in ways she hadn't in years. There was no one to judge her appearance or behavior, no creditors demanding payment, no church elders questioning her moral character. For the first time since Thomas's death, she could simply exist without constantly defending herself. But she also began to notice things about Matthew that intrigued and puzzled her. He was unfailingly polite and respectful, but he maintained a careful distance. He never touched her unnecessarily, never looked at her in ways that made her uncomfortable, never made comments about her appearance or behavior. It was as if he had decided she was completely off limits and was determined to honor that boundary. Most men in her experience had expectations, spoken or unspoken, about what they were owed in return for their protection or assistance. Matthew seemed to expect nothing beyond her presence and contribution to the household work. It was so unusual that Dorothy began to wonder if there was something wrong with her, some flaw that made her undesirable even to a man living in complete isolation. One morning, Dorothy woke to find fresh snow blocking the front door and wind howling around the house with frightening intensity. Matthew was already up, moving around the kitchen with more urgency than usual. "Bad storm," he said when she appeared. "Could last several days. We'll need to check on the animals more frequently. Make sure they have enough feed and water." Dorothy looked out the window at the swirling white chaos outside. "Is this normal for November in the mountains?" "Unfortunately, yes." Matthew was packing supplies into a canvas bag. "This is why I spent the summer stocking up on everything we might need." The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Dorothy got her first real taste of what mountain winters could be like. The wind never stopped, creating a constant background noise that made conversation difficult. Snow piled up against the windows, blocking much of the natural light and creating a sense of being buried alive. Matthew made regular trips to the barn to tend the animals, returning each time covered in snow and ice. Dorothy helped by keeping the fire burning and preparing hot meals to warm him when he came back inside. They fell into a routine of survival that required cooperation and mutual dependence. On the second night of the storm, a tree fell somewhere near the house with a crash that shook the walls. Matthew went out to investigate and came back with news that their woodpile was partially buried and the path to the barn was blocked. "We'll have to dig out tomorrow if the wind dies down," he said, removing his snow-covered coat. "Can't let the animals go without fresh water much longer." Dorothy watched him warm his hands by the fire and felt a surge of gratitude for his competence and preparation. Without him, she would have died in this storm, probably within hours of its beginning. The realization was both humbling and frightening. "You saved my life," she said quietly. Matthew looked up from the fire. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't bought me from the church, if you hadn't brought me here, I'd be dead now, and either from this storm or from whatever man had purchased me instead." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Dorothy moved to stand beside him at the fireplace. "I know exactly what my future looked like before you intervened. And I know what it looks like now because of your kindness." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "It wasn't kindness," he said finally. "Then what was it?" "Selfishness, maybe. I've been alone up here for 5 years, Maybe I was tired of my own company. Dorothy studied his profile in the firelight. I don't believe that. Believe what you want. Matthew stood and moved away from the fire. I'm going to check the animals one more time before bed. He left her standing by the fire, confused by his withdrawal. Every time she tried to express gratitude or acknowledge what he had done for her, Matthew deflected or dismissed her words. It was as if he couldn't accept being seen as heroic or generous. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. Snow had drifted against the house and outbuildings in sculptured waves that reached nearly to the roofline in places. The silence after days of howling wind was almost oppressive. Matthew began the work of digging out immediately. Dorothy helped as much as she could, but she lacked both the strength and the experience for this kind of labor. She watched Matthew work with systematic efficiency, creating paths to the barn and clearing snow from the roof before its weight could cause structural damage. How do you know how to do all this? She asked during a break. Trial and error, mostly. Lost part of my roof the first winter I was here because I didn't understand how much snow it could hold. Matthew leaned on his shovel and surveyed their progress. Learned fast after that. What if you got hurt? What if something happened to you out here? Then I'd deal with it the best I could. Matthew resumed shoveling, same as anyone else. But Dorothy was beginning to understand that Matthew's situation was not the same as anyone else's. He had chosen a life of complete self-reliance, accepting the risks that came with isolation in exchange for the freedom from society's demands and expectations. It was a choice that required not just skill and preparation, but also a kind of courage she was only beginning to appreciate. That evening, as they sat by the fire recovering from the day's work, Dorothy made a decision that had been building in her mind for days. I want to learn, she said. Matthew looked up from the book he was reading. Learn what? Everything. How to survive here, how to take care of the animals, how to preserve food, how to handle emergencies. Dorothy met his gaze steadily. I don't want to be helpless. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden. But I could be. If something happened to you, I wouldn't last a week on my own. Dorothy leaned forward in her chair. I've been dependent on other people my whole life. First my parents, then Thomas, now you. I'm tired of it. Matthew closed his book and studied her face. It's not easy, learning to be self-sufficient. It takes time and practice, and you'll make mistakes that could be dangerous. I'm willing to take that risk. Why? Dorothy considered the question carefully. Because I want to earn my place here. I want to contribute something meaningful, not just exist as your charity case. Matthew was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. All right, he said finally. We'll start tomorrow. Matthew proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. He began with basic skills: how to read weather signs, how to preserve food, how to maintain equipment, how to handle the animals safely. Dorothy threw herself into learning with the desperation of someone who understood that knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. She learned to milk the cows without getting kicked, to collect eggs without disturbing the hens, to split wood efficiently and safely. Matthew taught her to shoot, starting with small game and working up to the larger rifle they would need for hunting deer and elk. Her hands were soft from years of domestic work, and they blistered and bled as she adapted to the physical demands of mountain life. You're pushing yourself too hard, Matthew observed one evening as Dorothy soaked her injured hands in warm salt water. I'm trying to catch up to where I should be. Dorothy flexed her fingers, testing their mobility. You've had years to learn all this. I have maybe a few weeks before winter gets really serious. Winter's already serious, and you don't have to learn everything at once. Yes, I do. Dorothy's voice carried a determination that surprised them both. I won't be helpless again. I won't be someone who needs to be saved. Matthew studied her face in the lamplight. Is that what you think happened? That I saved you? Didn't you? Maybe we saved each other. Dorothy looked up from her hands. What do you mean? Matthew was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I came up here to get away from people, from their expectations and judgments and demands. I thought I wanted to be alone, but after 5 years I was starting to realize that isolation and independence aren't the same thing. I still don't understand. You give me a reason to maintain this place for someone other than myself. You give me someone to share the work with, someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to worry about and care for. Matthew's voice was quiet but steady. That's not nothing, Dorothy. That's not charity. Dorothy felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For weeks, she had been thinking of herself as the recipient of Matthew's generosity, a burden he had taken on out of kindness or pity. The idea that she might be giving him something valuable in return had never occurred to her. I've never thought of myself as someone worth caring about, she said quietly. Then you've been thinking wrong. The simple statement, delivered without drama or flowery language, meant more to Dorothy than any elaborate declaration could have. Matthew was not a man who wasted words or offered false comfort. If he said she was worth caring about, he meant it. As November turned to December, Dorothy's skills improved rapidly. She could now handle most of the daily chores without supervision. And Matthew began teaching her more complex tasks like preserving meat and maintaining equipment. She proved to have a natural aptitude for practical work, and her determination to become self-sufficient drove her to master new skills quickly. But it was the subtle changes in their relationship that meant the most to Dorothy. Matthew began to relax his careful politeness, allowing glimpses of humor and warmth that she suspected few people had ever seen. He still maintained physical distance, but the emotional barriers were slowly coming down. One evening, as they worked together in the kitchen preparing dinner, Dorothy realized she was happy. It was such an unfamiliar feeling that it took her a moment to identify it. She was warm, fed, safe, and useful. She was learning and growing and contributing to something meaningful. For the first time in her adult life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. "What are you smiling about?" Matthew asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing, everything." Dorothy continued chopping vegetables for their stew. "I was just thinking that I never expected to feel at home anywhere again." "And you do? Feel at home here?" "More than anywhere I've ever lived." Dorothy met his gaze. "Does that surprise you?" "A little," Matthew admitted. "Most people find the isolation difficult." "I think I needed the isolation. I needed to get away from other people's opinions and expectations long enough to figure out who I actually am." "And who are you?" Dorothy considered the question seriously. "I'm someone who's stronger than she thought. Someone who can learn and adapt and contribute. Someone who deserves to be treated with respect." She paused. "Someone who's grateful for second chances." Matthew nodded slowly. "Those are good things to be." That night, Dorothy lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain wilderness and realized that she no longer found them frightening. The wind in the trees had become a lullaby. The distant howl of wolves a reminder that she was part of something larger and wilder than the narrow confines of town society. She was becoming someone new, someone she actually liked. But her contentment was shattered the next morning when Matthew came in from checking the animals with news that changed everything. "There are tracks in the snow," he said, his expression grim. "Human tracks. Someone's been watching the house." Dorothy felt her stomach drop. "Who would be out here?" "I don't know, but they've been careful to stay hidden, which suggests they don't want to be seen." Matthew moved to the window and peered out at the tree line. "The tracks are at least a day old, maybe two. Whoever it was took time to study the layout of the property. Could it be someone lost? A traveler looking for shelter?" "Lost travelers don't hide in the woods and watch houses. They come to the door and ask for help." Matthew's voice was tight with concern. "Get dressed warmly. We're going to follow those tracks and see what we can learn." Dorothy dressed quickly in the heavy clothes Matthew had provided for outdoor work. He armed himself with his rifle and insisted she carry the smaller gun he had been teaching her to shoot. The weight of the weapon in her hands was both reassuring and terrifying. They followed the tracks into the forest, moving carefully through snow that was knee-deep in places. Matthew read the signs like a book, pointing out details that Dorothy was only beginning to recognize. The person who had made these tracks was experienced in wilderness travel, taking care to minimize their trail and avoid obvious landmarks. "Whoever this is knows what they're doing," Matthew said quietly. "This isn't some amateur wandering around lost." The tracks led to a ridge overlooking Matthew's property, where someone had clearly spent considerable time observing the house and outbuildings. There were signs of a small fire, carefully concealed and completely extinguished. Whoever had been here was both skilled and cautious. "What do you think they wanted?" Dorothy asked. "Information, most likely. Someone sent them to find out about our situation here." Matthew knelt beside the cold fire pit, examining the ashes. The question was who and why. They followed the tracks as far as they could, but the trail eventually led to rocky ground where it became impossible to follow. Matthew studied the terrain with growing frustration, clearly unhappy about losing the trail. "We need to get back to the house," he said finally, "and we need to be more careful about security." As they made their way home, Dorothy's mind raced with possibilities. Who would send someone to spy on them? The church elders who had sold her? Someone from town who disapproved of Matthew's intervention? Or something else entirely? "Matthew," she said as they approached the house, "what if this has to do with me? What if someone from town is looking for me?" "That's what I'm afraid of." Matthew's expression was grim. "The church might have decided they made a bad bargain, or there might be people who think they have a better claim on you than I do." The idea that someone might try to take her back to town filled Dorothy with cold terror. She had found peace and purpose in the mountains, had begun to build a new life based on her own choices and abilities. The thought of being dragged back to face the judgment and control of people who saw her as property was unbearable. "They can't force me to come back, can they?" she asked. "Legally? Probably not. The sale was witnessed and documented." Matthew's jaw was tight. But law and justice aren't always the same thing, especially for women. They spent the rest of the day making the property more secure. Matthew showed Dorothy how to bar the doors and windows from the inside, how to signal for help if she was alone and in danger, where weapons and supplies were hidden in case of emergency. The peaceful routine of their daily life was replaced by constant vigilance. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Dorothy found herself studying Matthew's face in the flickering light. He had risked his own safety and peace of mind to help her, and now that generosity might be putting him in danger. "I should leave," she said quietly. Matthew looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "What? If someone is looking for me, if my presence here is putting you at risk, I should go somewhere else. Where would you go?" Dorothy realized she had no answer. She had no money, no family, no friends who would take her in. The skills Matthew had taught her were sufficient for survival in his well-prepared homestead, but she couldn't survive alone in the wilderness during winter. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I won't let you suffer for helping me." Matthew set down his rifle and looked at her directly. "Dorothy, listen to me carefully. You're not going anywhere. This is your home now, and I'm not letting anyone take you away from it. But if there's trouble, then we'll face it together." Matthew's voice carried absolute certainty. "I didn't bring you here to abandon you at the first sign of difficulty." "Why?" Dorothy asked. "Why are you willing to fight for me?" Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because you matter," he said finally. "Because you deserve to live your own life, make your own choices. Because what they did to you in town was wrong, and I won't let it happen again." Dorothy felt tears threatening. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're brave and determined and kind. I know you work hard and don't complain about difficulties. I know you've been treated badly by people who should have protected you." Matthew met her gaze. "I know you deserve better than what the world has given you so far. And what if fighting for me cost you everything? What if they destroy your life here? Then we'll build something new somewhere else." Matthew's response was immediate and certain. "But we won't let them win." The next morning brought visitors. Dorothy was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Kaiser began barking with unusual intensity. Matthew appeared immediately, rifle in hand, and moved to the front window. "3 men on horseback," he said quietly. I recognized one of them, Elder Morrison from the church. Dorothy's blood turned to ice. Elder Morrison was the man who had conducted her auction, who had spoken of her as if she were livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. His presence here could only mean trouble. "Stay in the kitchen," Matthew instructed. "Let me handle this." "No." Dorothy moved to stand beside him at the window. "If this is about me, I should face it." Matthew studied her face, seeing the fear but also the determination. "All right, but stay behind me, and if I tell you to get down, you do it immediately." They opened the front door together as the three men approached. Elder Morrison rode in the center, flanked by two men Dorothy didn't recognize. All three were armed, and their expressions were not friendly. "Mr. Ramos," Elder Morrison called out as they stopped their horses 20 feet from the house, "we've come to discuss a business matter with you." "What kind of business?" Matthew's voice was steady but cold. "The woman you purchased last month. There's been some question about the legality of that transaction." Elder Morrison's tone was officious and self-important. "The church council has decided to void the sale and return your money." "The sale was legal and final," Matthew replied. "I have witnesses and documentation." "The church has reconsidered. We've decided that Mrs. Ruiz's debts can be satisfied through other means." One of the other men, a thin fellow with cruel eyes, spoke up. "She needs to come back to town with us." Dorothy stepped forward, despite Matthew's protective stance. "I'm not going anywhere." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Elder Morrison said. "You are still legally bound by your husband's debts, and the church has authority over how those debts are satisfied." "The debts were paid in full," Matthew said. "I have the receipt." "A receipt that the church council has declared invalid." The third man, heavy-set and armed with both a rifle and a pistol, moved his horse closer. "Now we can do this easy or we can do it hard, but the woman is coming with us." Matthew raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the men, but making his intentions clear. "She's not going anywhere against her will." "You're interfering with church business," Elder Morrison warned. "That's a serious matter. Your church business ended when I paid the debt in full." Matthew's voice carried deadly calm. "Now you're trespassing on my property and threatening my household. That's a serious matter, too." Dorothy felt the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. These men had come prepared for violence, and Matthew was clearly willing to meet force with force. But 3 against 1 were bad odds, especially when the woman was trying to protect someone else. "Matthew," she said quietly, "maybe I should—" "No." Matthew's response was immediate and final. "You're not going with them." "Be reasonable, Ramos," the thin man said. "You're outnumbered here. Give us the woman and nobody gets hurt." "The only way you're taking her is over my dead body," Matthew replied. "That can be arranged," the heavyset man said, his hand moving toward his pistol. The situation was escalating rapidly toward violence when Kaiser solved the problem in a way none of them had anticipated. The Baumeister, who had been growling low in his throat since the men arrived, suddenly charged toward their horses with a snarl that sounded more wolf than domestic animal. The horses, already nervous from the tension in the air, panicked. The heavy-set man's mount reared and spun, nearly throwing him from the saddle. The thin man's horse bolted sideways, carrying him 20 feet away before he could regain control. Elder Morrison's horse danced and snorted, requiring all his attention to keep from being thrown. In the confusion, Matthew advanced several steps, his rifle now clearly aimed at Elder Morrison. "I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave." "This isn't over," Elder Morrison called out as he fought to control his horse. "The church won't let this stand." "The church can go to hell," Matthew replied calmly, "and if any of you come back here, you'll join it." The three men retreated, but their parting looks promised that this confrontation was far from resolved. Dorothy watched them disappear into the forest with a mixture of relief and dread. "They'll be back," she said, "probably." Matthew lowered his rifle but didn't relax his vigilance. "But not today. Matthew, I can't let you fight my battles for me. This isn't your responsibility." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression serious but gentle. "Dorothy, you need to understand something. When I brought you here, when I made the choice to pay your debt and offer you a home, you became my responsibility. Not because you're property, but because you're family." The word hit Dorothy like a physical blow, family. She had never thought of herself as part of Matthew's family, had never imagined that he might see her that way. "Family protects each other," Matthew continued. "Family stands together against threats. That's what we're going to do." Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to be family to someone." "You're already doing it." Matthew's voice was soft but certain. "Every day, in 100 small ways, you're already doing it." That afternoon, Matthew began preparing for the possibility of a more serious confrontation. He cleaned and loaded every weapon in the house, checked their supplies of ammunition, and reviewed their defensive options. Dorothy helped as much as she could, but she felt the weight of responsibility for putting Matthew in this position. There has to be another way, she said as they worked together to reinforce the door and window frames. Some way to resolve this without violence. I'm open to suggestions, Matthew replied, testing the strength of a wooden bar they had installed across the front door. But those men didn't come here to negotiate. They came to take you by force. What if I wrote to the territorial authorities? What if we could get legal help? The nearest territorial marshal is 3 days' ride south, assuming he's even in his jurisdiction, and assuming he'd take the word of a woman and a mountain hermit over a church council. Matthew's tone was pragmatic rather than bitter. We're on our own out here, Dorothy. That's the reality of frontier life. As evening approached, they maintained careful watch from the windows. Matthew had positioned himself where he could see the most likely approaches to the house, while Dorothy kept watch on the barn and outbuildings. The animals seemed nervous, picking up on the tension that filled the air. Tell me about your family, Dorothy said during a quiet moment, trying to distract herself from the constant vigilance. You mentioned a sister. Sarah. She's 3 years younger than me, married a shopkeeper in San Francisco. Matthew's voice softened when he spoke of her. Smart as a whip, stubborn as a mule. You'd like her. What about your parents? Dead, died of fever when I was 22. Sarah was 19. Matthew adjusted his position at the window. That's when I decided to go west. Nothing keeping me back east after that. Dorothy understood the feeling of having nothing to hold you to a place. Do you miss her? Your sister? Every day, but she's building a good life in California, and I'm building one here. Sometimes that's how family works. Matthew glanced at her. What about you? Any family left? No one who would claim me now. Dorothy's voice was matter of fact. My parents died when I was 16. That's when I married Thomas, more for protection than love. His family never accepted me, said I wasn't good enough for their son. Their loss, Matthew said simply. The simple statement of support meant more to Dorothy than elaborate sympathy would have. Matthew had a way of cutting through complexity to the essential truth of a situation. She was beginning to understand that this directness was one of the things that made him so trustworthy. As night fell, they took turns keeping watch. Dorothy had the first shift, sitting by the front window with Matthew's smaller rifle across her lap. The moonlight on snow made the landscape visible, but also created shadows that could hide approaching threats. Every movement of wind in the trees made her heart race. Matthew relieved her at midnight, sending her to try to get some sleep. But Dorothy found herself lying in bed fully clothed, listening to every sound from outside. The peaceful security she had found in the mountains was gone, replaced by the constant fear that someone might try to take her away from the life she was building. Sometime in the early morning hours, she gave up on sleep and returned to the main room. Matthew was still at his post by the window, alert and watchful. He looked up when she appeared. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. Too much to think about. Dorothy moved to sit in the chair beside his. Matthew, what if they bring more men next time? What if they come with enough force that you can't fight them off? Then we'll have to be smarter than they are. Matthew's voice was calm but determined. There are advantages to knowing the terrain, to being prepared and motivated. And if that's not enough? Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then we'll face whatever comes together. But I won't let them take you, Dorothy, I promise you that. Even if it costs you everything. Everything I have here is meaningless without someone to share it with. Matthew met her gaze in the moonlight. You've given my life purpose again, Dorothy. You've made this place a home instead of just a refuge. I'm not giving that up without a fight. Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the fireplace. Matthew wasn't just protecting her out of duty or kindness. He was fighting for something that mattered to him personally, something that had become essential to his own happiness. I feel the same way, she said quietly, about this place, about the life we're building here. About you. Matthew turned to look at her fully. Dorothy, I know you've been keeping your distance, being careful not to pressure me or make demands. Dorothy's voice was steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. But I want you to know that you're not just my protector or my teacher. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like I'm worth something. You are worth something. You're worth everything. The simple declaration, spoken with absolute conviction, broke down the last of Dorothy's emotional defenses. She reached for Matthew's hand, and when he didn't pull away, she intertwined their fingers. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever those men try to do, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Matthew squeezed her hand gently. Mine too. They sat together in the moonlight, hands clasped, watching for threats that might emerge from the forest. But Dorothy no longer felt afraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn brought no sign of the churchmen, but Matthew remained cautious. He went about his morning chores armed and alert, checking the tree line constantly for signs of movement. Dorothy helped where she could, but she could see the strain of constant vigilance wearing on him. This can't continue indefinitely, she said as they worked together to feed the animals. You can't live in a state of siege. It won't be indefinite. One way or another, this will be resolved soon. Matthew's tone was grim. Men like that don't have the patience for a long campaign. Dorothy was about to respond when Kaiser began barking again. But this time his tone was different. Instead of the aggressive warning bark he had used for the churchmen, this was the excited greeting he reserved for welcome visitors. Someone's coming, Matthew said, reaching for his rifle. Wait. Dorothy listened carefully to the dog's vocalizations. Kaiser sounds happy, not threatened. Maybe it's not them. They moved to the front window and saw a single rider approaching, a woman on horseback leading a pack mule. As she drew closer, Dorothy could see that she was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair and a confident bearing that spoke of someone comfortable in the wilderness. Do you know her? Dorothy asked. Matthew's expression had changed from wariness to amazement. I think that's my sister. They opened the front door as the rider approached, and Dorothy heard Matthew's sharp intake of breath. The woman dismounted with practiced ease and turned to face them with a smile that transformed her entire face. Hello, Matthew, she said. Surprise. Sarah, Matthew's voice was incredulous. What are you doing here? How did you even find me? It's a long story. Sarah's gaze moved to Dorothy with frank curiosity. But first, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend? Sarah, this is Dorothy Ruiz. Dorothy, my sister Sarah. Matthew seemed to be struggling to process his sister's unexpected appearance. Sarah, what's going on? Why are you here? I left California. My husband turned out to be less than advertised. Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, but Dorothy could hear the pain underneath. I remembered you mentioning this place in your letters, so I decided to come visit my big brother. You traveled all this way alone? Matthew's voice was filled with concern and admiration in equal measure. I'm tougher than I look. Sarah grinned. Besides, I had good teachers. Dorothy watched the reunion with mixed emotions. She was happy for Matthew, knowing how much he missed his sister. But Sarah's arrival complicated their already difficult situation. How much should they tell her about the threat from the church? How would her presence affect the confrontation that seemed inevitable? Come inside, Matthew said, taking Sarah's horse's reins. You must be exhausted. Actually, I'm starving more than tired. I've been living on trail rations for the past week. Sarah shouldered her saddlebags and followed them toward the house. Something smells wonderful in there. Dorothy realized she had left breakfast cooking on the stove. I should check the food, she said, hurrying toward the kitchen. As she worked to prepare a meal for 3 instead of 2, Dorothy listened to Matthew and Sarah catching up in the main room. Their conversation was warm and natural, full of the easy affection of siblings who genuinely liked each other. But Dorothy also heard the careful way Matthew avoided mentioning their current troubles. So, Sarah said as they sat down to eat, are you two married? Dorothy nearly choked on her coffee. Matthew's expression became carefully neutral. Dorothy is a friend who needed a place to stay, he said. She's been helping with the household work. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. I see, and how long has this arrangement been going on? About 6 weeks, Dorothy answered, finding her voice. Your brother saved me from a very difficult situation. Did he now? Sarah's tone was interested rather than judgmental. Matthew always was one for rescuing strays. Sarah, Matthew warned. What? It's true. Remember that dog with the broken leg you found when you were 12? And the bird with the damaged wing? And that girl from school whose father was beating her? Sarah grinned at her brother. You've always had a soft spot for creatures in need of help. Dorothy felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm not a creature in need of help. No, I can see that. Sarah's assessment was frank but not unkind. You look like someone who can take care of herself. I'm just saying my brother has a pattern of helping people who deserve better than what they've gotten. The conversation was interrupted by Kaiser's warning bark. All three of them froze and Matthew was on his feet immediately, reaching for his rifle. Are you expecting someone? Sarah asked quietly. Unfortunately, yes. Matthew moved to the window. Dorothy, get down. Sarah, stay low and away from the windows. Dorothy could see the tension in Matthew's shoulders as he peered out at the approaching riders. How many, she asked. 5 this time. They brought reinforcements. Sarah looked between Matthew and Dorothy with growing understanding. What kind of trouble are you two in? The kind that might get people killed, Matthew replied grimly. The 5 riders approached with more confidence than the previous group had shown. Elder Morrison was again in the lead, but now he was accompanied by 4 armed men who looked like hired gunfighters rather than church members. Their intention was clearly to overwhelm any resistance through superior numbers and firepower. Ramos, Elder Morrison called out when they were within shouting distance. We've come to collect what belongs to the church. Send the woman out and there won't be any trouble. The woman doesn't belong to anyone, Matthew replied from behind the barricaded door, and she's not going anywhere. You're outnumbered and outgunned, one of the hired men shouted. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah had positioned herself at a side window with a rifle of her own, moving with the competence of someone familiar with weapons. Matthew, she said quietly, who are these people and what do they want with Dorothy? The church sold Dorothy to pay her dead husband's debts, Matthew explained tersely. I bought her freedom, but now they've decided they want her back. Sarah's expression hardened. Over my dead body. That's what I'm afraid of, Dorothy said. Sarah, you shouldn't be involved in this. You just got here. Family is family. Family, Sarah replied firmly, and anyone trying to drag a woman off against her will is going to have to go through me too. Outside, the hired gunmen were spreading out to surround the house. Matthew tracked their movements through the windows, calling out positions to his sister. Dorothy felt helpless, watching the 2 people she cared most about prepare to risk their lives for her freedom. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Some way to resolve this without bloodshed. I'm open to suggestions, Matthew replied, not taking his eyes off the men outside. Dorothy thought frantically. What did these men really want? Elder Morrison was motivated by power and control, but the hired guns were probably just interested in money. If she could find a way to make taking her more expensive than leaving her alone. What if we offered them more money than they're being paid, she suggested. With what? Matthew asked. I spent most of my cash buying your freedom in the first place. I have money, Sarah said unexpectedly. Quite a lot, actually. My husband may have been a bastard, but he was a wealthy bastard, and California law was surprisingly generous about property rights for abandoned wives. Matthew stared at his sister. How much money? Enough to make this problem go away, if that's what you want. Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact. The question is whether these men can be bought off, or if this is about something more than money. Before anyone could respond, one of the hired guns called out from behind the barn. We're getting tired of waiting, Ramos. Send out the woman or we start shooting. Shoot away, Matthew replied. But remember that we're shooting back. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Dorothy could see the men outside growing impatient, conferring among themselves about their next move. She realized that violence was becoming inevitable unless someone found a way to break the deadlock. I'm going out there, she said suddenly. Like hell you are, Matthew responded immediately. Not to surrender, to negotiate. Dorothy moved toward the door. If this is really about money, maybe we can make a deal. Dorothy, no, it's too dangerous. Everything is dangerous now. Dorothy's voice was steady despite her fear. But maybe I can buy us some time, find a way to resolve this peacefully. Sarah was studying Dorothy with new respect. What do you have in mind? I don't know yet, but I know these men, know how they think. Maybe I can find something they want more than they want me. Matthew grabbed her arm gently but firmly. I won't let you walk out there alone. Then come with me, both of you. Dorothy looked between Matthew and Sarah. Show them we're united, that they can't intimidate us. That's either very brave or very stupid, Sarah observed. Probably both, Dorothy admitted, but I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being afraid. These people have controlled my life for too long. Matthew studied her face, seeing the determination and courage that had been growing stronger every day since she had arrived in the mountains. All right, he said finally, but we do this carefully, and if shooting starts, you get behind cover immediately. They opened the front door together, Matthew and Sarah flanking Dorothy as she stepped onto the porch. The hired gunmen immediately raised their weapons, but Elder Morrison held up a hand to stop them. Mrs. Ruiz, he called out, I'm glad you've come to your senses. I haven't come to surrender, Dorothy replied, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. I've come to make you an offer. You're not in a position to make offers. Aren't I? Dorothy stepped forward, ignoring Matthew's protective instincts. You've brought 5 armed men to take one woman by force. That suggests you're not as confident in your legal position as you claim to be. Elder Morrison's face flushed with anger. The church has absolute authority in this matter. The church has no authority over me, Dorothy replied firmly. I'm not a member of your congregation. I never signed any agreement accepting your jurisdiction. And the debt you claim I owe was paid in full by Mr. Ramos. The church council has declared that sale invalid. The church council has no legal standing to void a properly witnessed transaction. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of education and experience. I'm an attorney, Mr. Morrison, and what you're attempting here is kidnapping and extortion. Dorothy stared at Sarah in surprise. An attorney? That was a detail Matthew had never mentioned. Elder Morrison looked uncertain for the first time. The territorial authorities will support the church's position. Will they? Sarah's smile was sharp. Because I've already sent word to the territorial marshal describing this situation. He should be arriving within the next day or two, along with a federal judge who's very interested in cases involving the illegal sale and transportation of human beings. Dorothy realized that Sarah was bluffing, but it was a convincing performance. The hired gunmen were looking at each other uncertainly, clearly not eager to face federal authorities. You're lying, Elder Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Are you willing to bet your freedom on that assumption? Sarah's tone was conversational. Because kidnapping is a federal crime, Mr. Morrison, and these gentlemen you've hired could find themselves facing charges as accessories. The standoff stretched for several long moments. Dorothy could see doubt creeping into the faces of the hired men. They had probably expected a simple job, overwhelming a single mountain man and taking a helpless woman. Now they were facing the possibility of federal prosecution and armed resistance from 3 determined people. Finally, one of the gunmen spoke up. Morrison, you didn't say anything about federal marshals or lawyers. This job just got a lot more complicated than you advertised. She's bluffing, Elder Morrison insisted. There are no federal authorities coming. Maybe, but maybe not. The gunman was already backing toward his horse, and I'm not getting hanged for kidnapping over your church politics. One by one, the hired men began to withdraw. Elder Morrison found himself alone, his authority crumbling as his backup disappeared. He looked at Dorothy with hatred and frustration. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, Dorothy replied firmly. It's over because I say it's over. I'm not your property, I'm not your responsibility, and I'm not your problem. Find someone else to blame for your church's financial difficulties. Elder Morrison wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving the 3 of them standing in the snow. Dorothy felt her knees go weak with relief and reaction. Matthew caught her arm to steady her. Is it really over? She asked. I think so, Sarah replied. Men like that are bullies at heart. When their bluff gets called, they usually fold. Dorothy looked at Sarah with new respect. You really are an attorney? Among other things. I told you my husband was wealthy. He was also a lawyer. And he taught me quite a lot before he decided he preferred his secretary to his wife. Sarah's smile was rueful. But that's a story for another day. Matthew was still scanning the tree line, making sure all the threats had really withdrawn. "We should get inside," he said, "just in case." As they walked back to the house, Dorothy felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most to her. The churchmen might return, other challenges might arise, but she was no longer alone and helpless. She was part of a family that would fight for each other, protect each other, and build something meaningful together. "Thank you," she said to Matthew and Sarah as they reached the safety of the house. "For what?" Matthew asked. "For showing me what it means to belong somewhere, for teaching me that I'm worth fighting for." Dorothy's voice was soft but certain. "For giving me a home." Matthew smiled, the first completely relaxed expression she had seen on his face in days. "You gave us a home too, Dorothy. Before you came, this was just a place I lived. Now it's something worth protecting." Sarah looked between them with satisfaction. "Well then," she said, "I guess I arrived just in time to help defend the family homestead." As they settled in by the fire, Dorothy realized that her story had come full circle. She had started as property to be sold, had become a woman learning to stand on her own, and had ended up as part of a family that chose each other rather than being bound by blood or law. It was a better ending than she had ever dared to hope for. Outside, the mountain wind continued to blow through the pine trees, but inside the house was warm with the kind of security that comes from being surrounded by people who truly care about your welfare. Dorothy Ruiz had finally found her place in the world, and no one would ever take it away from her again. The fire crackled in the hearth as the three of them planned their future together, a future built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that some things are worth fighting for. Dorothy had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that she deserved to be treated with dignity and care, and that home is not a place but a feeling of belonging that comes from being valued for who you truly are. As night fell over the mountains, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, completely, and permanently free.